Hello lovely people, I hope you are having a wonderful start to August, but before I move on properly with my August reading, I need to recap July for you guys. July was a pretty average slash just below average reading month for me. I did manage to read over 3,000 pages, which is kind of like my benchmark. Like 3,500 I would say is kind of like where I really want to be, at least, if not towards like 4,000 pages. I read 9 books, which is also pretty standard for me. I did not read as much as I usually do, but I still did, I think, a pretty good job. And the ratings were very high for July. I did not have any new favorites. There were no 5-star reads, but we also had no 2-star reads, which is definitely a bonus. So getting into the stats before we hit up those reviews, in July I read a total of 3,387 pages, which is an average of 109 pages per day. This is, as I said, a little bit less than I like to be, but considering I was on holiday for such a long time, it's decent, I'll take it. For the star ratings, we had 3 3-star reads and 6 4-star reads, breaking down to an average of 3.6 stars per book, which used to be bang on average for me. 3.6 stars was my average rating for a long time, but in recent years that is quite higher than we usually see. For the demographics, I read 7 adult books and 2 young adult. For the formats, we had 6 standardly formatted novels, 2 comic books and 1 audiobook. For the genres, I read 4 fantasy books, 2 fantasy romance, 1 mystery, 1 romance and 1 sci-fi. And finally, for the place where I sourced these books from, 4 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024. 2 of them I read on Kindle Unlimited, 2 of them I have hauled this year, and 1 is a book that I borrowed from my library. So the first thing that I did in July was film episode 6 of Shelve It or Scrap It, which I will link for you guys if you need to catch up. It was a very successful episode, and I read 3 books in total for that. The first one being Delilah Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake. So this is a romance that I got. It was like a very early Afterlight book, and I have read from Ashley Herring Blake before. I have read Girl Made of Stars, yeah, that's what it's called, and also the first of her middle grade books, and I have enjoyed both of them. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that I did also enjoy Delilah Green Doesn't Care, but I didn't really know kind of what shape a romance would take from Ashley Herring Blake, and it turns out it is exactly what you would expect if you've read their contemporary work. So this one is following a woman called Delilah, who is a photographer, and she is not quite being forced to, but she's being paid a lot of money by her stepmother to return to the small town that she's from to photograph her stepsister's wedding. But she hates her stepfamily because when she was a child, she lost her mother when she was very young. Her father remarried and then he died shortly afterwards, and in the aftermath of this, Delilah was waiting for this woman, her stepmother, to step into a motherly role, and that never really happened. So Delilah watched her stepsister Iris be coddled and like pushed to achieve by her stepmother while she was like borderline neglected, and she feels like her stepsister was in on this as well. So she really doesn't want to go back, but as soon as she arrives, she is confronted with one of her stepsister's best friends who has a little bit of an attraction to Delilah, although she doesn't recognize her at first. So Claire is actually struggling a little bit herself. She is a single parent. She had a baby with her high school sweetheart when I think she was around 19, and they stayed together for a while, but eventually they broke up, and he has commitment issues almost. Like, he comes back into town, he says that he's changed, he's going to be there for his daughter, and then he bounces shortly afterwards. So at this time, he has once again come back into Claire's life, and she is struggling to trust him. She's also a little bit overbearing towards her daughter because of this, where she's trying to make the kid's father kind of like reinforce boundaries and rules and be responsible, and she's coming across as like this really strict, boring parent that she doesn't want to be, but it's like really coming from a place of worry. Throughout the course of this book, it is a romance, so those two grow closer while they're also dealing with their own personal issues. I gave this 3 stars because I did enjoy it, but there were some elements that I enjoyed more than others. It's actually the romance that I didn't love in this. I did enjoy it, but it didn't kind of like sweep me away. I'm not ride or die for this couple, but I did really love the contemporary aspects in here. I really felt for Delilah, and I feel like Ashley Herring Blake did a really good job of putting you in Delilah's shoes and making you feel the way that she feels towards the characters who are the main players in this story, as she she also kind of works through these issues and things kind of tensions dissolve a little bit. I also really not struggled to read this, but this was a hard read for me in parts because I did feel like I related to Delilah in the way, like, experiences that I've had in my life based on the way that other people react to grief and the way that I react to grief, and how that doesn't always encourage like a supportive environment. Sometimes that causes tension and like fractured relationships because the way that two people grieve is like not in harmony, like it results in clashes. So I definitely identified with that, and I loved the contemporary struggles in here, even though like the romance was fine. I liked it. It's just I wasn't feeling like warm fuzzy butterflies for it or anything. So I did decide to unhaul this one for shelve it or scrap it, but I would be tempted to pick up the sequels to this as they are available at my library. I just don't feel like I need a copy of this one on my shelves. I then picked up like a low-key 5-star prediction for me, which was The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez, which sadly did not turn out to be 5 stars, but I did really enjoy it. So this one is a sci-fi story about a boy who appears on this planet. Like, he comes crashing down to this planet and he's taken in by the people there, and he has no idea how he got where he is. So he's taken in by these people, and every so often a spaceship arrives and takes all of the stuff that this planet has been harvested. So when that happens, they take this boy with them as well. We're mainly following, is it 3 perspectives in here? Yes, we are following the perspective of this boy, we are following this perspective of the captain that picks him up and takes him with her, and we are also following the perspective of a woman who kind of invented this world on an apocalyptic Earth, or an Earth on the verge of apocalypse. She is the person who invented the space stations that formed the basis of the society that humans now live in. So the core plot of this is that after the boy is in the care of this captain, she meets with this lady who is the creator of these space stations. It's like, it's very futuristic, but she has found a way to kind of preserve her life even though she was an original resident of Earth. And this woman thinks that this boy has a power that is going to be crucial to the advancement of the human race and like the technology that they're capable of. So she asks this captain to keep the boy outside of the control of, it's like allied space, you know, like the area of space under government control. She sends this woman with her crew and this boy to the fringe of this society to keep him outside of the eye of this government until he has matured to a point where his powers manifest, and they can maybe look into how they can harness that or learn from that to advance technology. So this is a journey that is going to take 15 years, so the captain does not take on this responsibility lightly, and it is predominantly a story that focuses on the found family of this crew. Saying that, this story does take a while until it gets to that point where the plot kicks off, and because of that, the part of this where they're just kind of traveling together outside of society is not especially long within this book, even though the themes and the found family present are at the forefront. Something that I really enjoyed about this book, and something that I do often enjoy about sci-fi, there are 2 very different types of sci-fi that I typically enjoy. One is kind of like books that are more about the vibes and the plot, and the other ones are ones that essentially have like a fantasy plot that is somehow set in space, like Red Rising and Gideon the Ninth. This one, it definitely falls into the camp of the former because it is a very slow moving story that focuses more on the point that it is trying to get across and the underlying themes than it does necessarily the concrete plot. I didn't love the way that this one ended, which I feel like is part of why this wasn't a 5-star for me, but I feel like my real kind of issue with this is that I wasn't as attached to the characters as I felt that I needed to be to truly adore this story. And I think that that is because some of the perspectives that we have in here that make up the story are kind of like side players or bit players in this story, but because we focus on them a little bit more at points, it takes you away from the characters that you're kind of spending the majority of the story with. Like, the first chapter of this is not a central character to the story, but it is very much establishing the setup. And chapter 1 is 36 pages. So it takes like a little bit of time to get going, and I feel like that is potentially why I didn't give this 5 stars. This book is often compared to the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers, and I definitely saw that within here, but I do feel like it's important to note that Becky Chambers books are a lot more wholesome than this is, and it kind of lulls you into a false sense of security because it goes along that Becky Chambers route for a while, where we're following the crew and their relationships as they're building, the minor kind of difficulties that they have in this like long voyage that they're going on. But in this book, things get a lot more sinister, and there are a lot more really deep, hard-hitting events in this book that take it in a completely different direction. So if you're going into this book based on hearing that it's similar to Becky Chambers, do know that it does take a darker turn. The stakes are a lot higher. There are a lot more plot twists in here than you do find in the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers, and the way that they are kind of explored, because there are hard-hitting topics explored in Becky Chambers, but it is in more of like a retrospective, almost conversational, like let's work through this really dark shit, as opposed to the events happening in real time as they do in The Vanished Birds. So yeah, I did enjoy this one. It wasn't the 5-star that I expected it to be, but I would be tempted to read more from Simon Jimenez in the future, and I have heard really good things about, is it called The Spear Cuts Through Water? Possibly my favorite book of the month was The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy by Megan Bannon. I truly did not know what to expect from this one, and it was not what I even thought that it was going to be. So this one is following a young woman called Mercy who is an undertaker, and a ranger, a marshal called Hart, and they hate each other. The reason why they dislike each other is actually based on a misunderstanding, and that is one of the reasons why I struggled to get into this book at first, because I love hate to love and like enemies to lovers, but only if there is either a genuine reason for the dislike, or because the two characters disliking each other like fills them full of this fiery passion where they just have to like clash constantly. So it being based on a misunderstanding doesn't really create that vibe for me. But essentially the first time that they met, Hart wasn't in a very good mood, and neither was Mercy, so they got into like a little bit of an argument, and every time they see each other from that point onwards, like they kind of end up clashing because of the misconceptions of their first meeting. But essentially both of these characters are misunderstood. Mercy is trying to keep her family's business afloat, and the name of her business, the family business, I think is called Birdsall and Son, so they're kind of waiting for the son to return from university so that he can take up the role of being the next undertaker. And when Mercy's younger brother turns up, he confesses that he actually would rather bake cakes and cook, like he does not want to be an undertaker, and Mercy is just trying to keep this business afloat and doesn't know what to do about this. Her sister also comes to her with a secret that she doesn't want the rest of the family to know, and Mercy is kind of floundering under all of these familial secrets that she's trying to keep while also trying to like manage this business. Her father has also had a heart attack, so he is not in a position to be able to take up the role in the business that he has in the past, and she is just really struggling under the weight of all of this. On the flip side of that, we have Hart, and Hart has suffered a lot of loss in his life, and because of that he likes to be alone. He's a little bit of a lone ranger, and his job as a marshal is essentially to kill zombies in a magical realm, which is the easiest way to simplify it. And he has been doing this alone for a very long time after the loss of his like mentor, his family, and also more recently his dog. So his superior, who also used to be a friend of his until they had a disagreement, has now assigned him an apprentice, essentially forcing him to not go it alone and kind of rejoin the world and build connections again. So amongst all of this, Hart writes a letter anonymously. He addresses it to a friend, and the fates that be kind of make it so that Mercy ends up with this letter, and they start communicating anonymously throughout these letters, not knowing that they are communicating with their nemesis. So it reminded me a lot, it's obviously like a You've Got Mail situation, but it also reminded me a lot of Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, even though I do prefer this book much more. They are similar in that kind of regard where we have a rivalry, there's the You've Got Mail kind of influence, but aside from that they're very different. I think that the fantasy element is much better executed in here, and also the tone of Divine Rivals is a little bit more serious because this is like more of a rom-com, more light-hearted. I was lukewarm about this throughout the beginning. I really struggled to get a grip on the world building in here. I went into this assuming it was Victorian because Mercy is an undertaker, which obviously was just an assumption that I made. This one is more of like a kind of almost Wild West setting, maybe a little bit steampunky. It's kind of like a small town that is desert adjacent, and then we also have the Wild West vibe that is provided by the marshals in here, which I would say definitely dress Wild Westy. But then something that was kind of throwing me off is that this is also really modern. They don't have electricity, and some of the things that they have, like they have almost like radios which are wind up, if I remember correctly. But then they also have headlights on cars which are called auto ducks that aren't explained like how they're powered. And also a lot of the things in this world are water based, like the cars are called auto ducks, and I think the horses are called like aquamaris or something like that, and they have webbed feet to walk on water. Even though there is no more water in this world, assumedly, like from this book, from what I can gather, than there is in our own world. So I really struggled to get a grip on where this was, like the inspiration for this town and what it looked like. And that is something that isn't necessarily supposed to be taken too seriously in this book, but something that is important to me as a very visual reader to establish the setting and the tone and the atmosphere of the story. It's important to me that I have like a good grip on the world. And also, like I said, with the relationship between Heart and Mercy starting with this misunderstanding, I was struggling to vibe with them. However, I'm not sure how far into this book it was, maybe just under the halfway point. Something about this story really started to sweep me away, and I ended up loving the relationship between Heart and Mercy. Something that I really love in romances, fantasy romance usually, which this is, but it has like more of a light-hearted nature than things like, I don't know, Crescent City from Blood and Ash, is when through establishing a relationship like characters deal with their own kind of trauma, which I guess is something we also saw in Delilah Green Doesn't Care. And I really like it when characters are kind of in a romantic relationship, they build like a friendship and are kind of there for each other and support each other at the same time as they grow closer. And while we started off on a rocky road with these two, I feel like they definitely kind of started building towards that and dealing with their own issues and processing things, which I really did enjoy. So I have actually ordered the sequel to this, which is The Undermining of, is it Twyla and Frank, or Frank and Twyla, which I'm very excited to get to. This was a surprising one for me. I went into it very ambivalent, not knowing what I was going to think about it, and I ended up thoroughly enjoying it. I then read the second book in the Age of Madness trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, which is The Trouble with Peace, which is the penultimate book for this round of Catch Up Book Club. This is definitely still my favorite series at the minute that Joe Abercrombie has written, or my favorite. Not all of them are series, but it's my favorite kind of section of the First Law world to date. It's very hard for me to give you a synopsis of this because the plot of this series is very much built up by little small increments of every book that has come before them. I think that you could read it as a trilogy, but it's not something that has like a plot and like a clear end goal. We're not trying to save the world or anything. We're kind of just trying to keep on keeping on while the politics and everything shifts around us. So in here we are mainly following members of like the nobility, the royalty. We have a few common people that we follow, but they're mainly people that are higher up in the society who are struggling with the same kind of things we were struggling with at the beginning of the First Law series. It is a grimdark story. It's very political, and in the very first series in the First Law world, we are mainly following a country that is on the verge of war. So that is still a threat within here, but on top of that we are facing major societal upheaval as we are on the brink of a workers' revolution, which I would say forms the main focus of this plot. While in the background you have the war going on, and you also have the influence of the immortals of this world, which is essentially the last vestiges of magic who are kind of meddling from the background. It is also a generational series, so we are following the descendants of some characters that we have met before, which makes this series extra interesting to me because I have like obviously the knowledge of all of the books that came before this one. So I gave book one in this series 5 stars, loved it. Did not love this one as much. I would give it like, if I was being super particular, I don't typically give half-star ratings. I would say it is a 4.5 though. I think it was very close to 5 stars, and it's not because it wasn't good that I didn't love it, it's because I didn't like it as much that I gave it like a little bit of a lower rating that I gave book one. So the difference between book one of this series for me and everything that's come before that in the First Law is that in book one we were given characters that we could actually root for. Characters that had not done horrible things. Characters who had not had horrible things done to them. And this was very different to anybody we'd really followed in the First Law world up to this point. And so I felt like I could really root for them because they were genuinely like not terrible people. However, I did say in my TBR, like after reading that book, going into the rest of this series, I knew based on Joe Abercrombie's writing and his stories that I've read so far that that was going to change. And so when I started this book and immediately we had some of those characters that I'd really started to love start to have really questionable opinions and do some not so great things, I kind of wasn't having a good time. So I didn't love the beginning of this book. I thought that it had a really climactic end, and I love the position that this book ends on going into book 3. But I was salty at the beginning because the characters were going in the direction that I expected them to, but it's not a direction that I wanted them to go to. So the last book I'm actually going to be reading in August. I'm scared, but I'm excited because it is obviously like it's a big feat to have read the entire First Law, and that's another like big fantasy series checked off my bucket list. For my Patreon 24-hour readathon for July, I read Wicked by Sarah Shepard, which is book 5 in the Pretty Little Liars series. At this point, I have come to expect the odd numbered books in this series to be better than the even numbered books. I do not know why that is, but I have really enjoyed books 1, 3 and 5, and I've enjoyed books 2 and 4 a little bit less. And book 4 was the climax of a story arc, so you would expect that one to be a little bit impactful, and book 5, which is the setup of a new story arc, to be a little bit more dull. But for whatever reason with this series, that is just simply not the case. So I'm sure you all know at this point, especially because I'm reading a book a month. If you didn't know this before, then you definitely do now. But this one is a young adult mystery series that is following a group of girls who had a friend, like part of their friendship group, who went missing about 1.5 to 2 years before the start of this story. So they kind of drifted apart after this because she was the glue that was holding them all together. And at the start of this series, they have to come together to get to the bottom of some anonymous texts that they have been receiving, threatening to expose all of their secrets. It's toxic, it's full of red flags, it's a product of the early 2000s and it shows. But it is also very entertaining and very dramatic. So I am very much still enjoying my read through of this series. It's almost like a palate cleanser for me, and this is unusual because a lot of the books that people read as kind of like quick reads that are entertaining, they don't think too much about. I usually hate that format of books. It's one of the reasons why I typically don't enjoy paranormal romance, because I just don't care enough to come back to read like 15, 20, 25 books that are all kind of like loosely linked together or following a plot, but like none of them are super deep. For some reason with this, it really works for me, and I do keep coming back just to read another 250 page installment in this series. I don't know why that is, but while it's working, we're gonna keep rolling with it. And this is one that I gave 4 stars. I then read the one library book that I had for the month, and it was a flop. It was a flop, and I'm sad about it because a lot of people love this book, and that is Powerless by Lauren Roberts. So this is one of those super hyped like book talk fantasy romances. It is a YA. It was described to me as something that's like super fun, not to be taken too seriously, but is like kind of a good time. So I definitely went into it with like low expectations, and I'm glad that I did, because if I'd have gone into this with high expectations, it would have been like a complete flop. So this one is a YA fantasy romance following a girl in this broken society where there's some sort of event that happened where some people ended up with superpowers, and then the royalty in this world lied and said that if you don't have superpowers, then you are infecting the people with superpowers, and essentially he's trying to create this like perfect superpowered society. So we then started purging all of the normal people without powers, and our main character was trained by her father to fake it until she makes it. And she has pretended to be a psychic, which is like a low-level superpowered person, her entire life. And the way that she does this is through the power of observation. So she takes notice of the people around her and she predicts their future based on that. She'll see that somebody has a tan line where a wedding ring used to be, and she'll say like, you're having difficulties in your marriage, and based on your behavior it's probably because you're a massive dick. And one day she bumps into one of the princes of the world. She steals from him because she is a thief. That's how she gets by. And she is about to walk away with her massive treasure trove when he gets attacked, and she saves his life. So this brings some attention to her, and she ends up pulled into this tournament that is not necessarily a fight to the death, but people can die during it. I still do not understand the purpose of these trials, because it's not like, it's marketed as Red Queen meets the Hunger Games, but it's not like the Hunger Games in that this tournament serves as a reminder of like why everyone has to obey the capital, because they put influential people, including like the prince, the prince's cousin, like the prince's adopted brother, all end up in this arena where they might die, and I just don't understand the purpose of it. But while that is going on, there is also a rebellion that is trying to undermine the royalty to stop them from killing all of the regular people as well. So there's a lot going on here. I went into this kind of expecting it to be a little bit like Fourth Wing, which is a book that I really enjoyed. I still not have read the sequel, but I really enjoyed that. It's not the best written thing that I've ever read, but I feel like it has a very compelling romance and a bunch of tropes that people really love, executed in a way that people really love them to be executed, which I think is why so many people like it. To me, Powerless is not that. It is definitely, in my opinion, better written than Fourth Wing was, but I don't think that anything that Powerless does is any better than any of the things it has been inspired by. I put inspired in quotations because this is marketed, as I said, as Red Queen meets the Hunger Games. And I would say that this has definitely been inspired by the Hunger Games. I would say that it has taken massive chunks of Red Queen. And Red Queen is one of my favorite series. The first book is a book that I have read multiple times. I've read it, I think, at least 5 times. So I'm very familiar with it. And I could recognize in this book, like, actual scenes that are the same as the scenes in Red Queen. Like the way that she meets the prince in the street. There's a bit where like he teaches her to dance, some of the powers of the princes, and the way that there's like 2 brothers. It's like almost a love triangle situation, but not really. It was all very Red Queen, and it was a little bit too much Red Queen, you know? Even the society, the fact that we had that rebellion plot running underneath and the way that it was executed, it was a lot, it was. And sometimes we can not necessarily overlook this because it's still not great, but sometimes if something very closely resembles something else but it's done very, very well, you can say, okay, well, it's taken this thing that wasn't great and it's like executed it in a way that's so much better. I actually don't think that Powerless is any better than anything it's taken from. I think that the original things that it has taken from are so much better than this. The reason why I gave this 3 stars, this was definitely going to be a 2. I was heading for a 2, but halfway through I switched to the audiobook, and I do think that this book has a very good audio narration. So I could be convinced to continue as an audiobook to listen to because I always have one on the go, but a lot of the time it doesn't have to be anything spectacular, it just has to be something entertaining to listen to, and Powerless definitely provided that. But I don't think it's very good. Like, I didn't enjoy it very much. I do see why other people like it and the elements in there that generally kind of like draw people in, but I can't get behind the plot because it's not only a plot that I've seen before in terms of like, okay, yeah, it's kind of old, it's kind of tired, I want something new. It's literally something that I have seen and read before in almost exactly the same configuration, and the romance I didn't care about. So for me, it didn't really have anything to hook me in aside from that really good audiobook. And I am sad about it because I went into this like really wanting to enjoy it and kind of get the hype, and it went completely over my head. I then finished a series, yay, I hope y'all are proud of me, and that series was Die by Kieran Gillen. So I read volume 3, which is The Great Game, and volume 4, which I think was called Bleed. Both of these are available on Kindle Unlimited, and I read them in transit on the train on the way to London to catch my flight to San Diego. So this is a series that is following a group of adults. I believe that they're in their early 40s, but when they were teenagers, they were sucked into a fantasy world using dice that were given to them by their friend that had created this role-playing game. So it's very kind of like Stranger Things D&D vibes, and they were missing for 2 years. They came back to the real world, but there was only, I think there's 6 in total, and only 5 of them came back. So when they're in their early 40s, one of them receives a 20-sided dice in the mail, and they are once again transported back to this fantasy world. So they are trying to find their way back home, but to be able to come back home, as in the first instance when they did it, they all have to agree to return. And based on where they are in their lives, some of them desperately need to be able to return home, and some of them are actually not having a great time in the real world and wouldn't mind sticking around in this fantasy world where they have some like super cool powers for a little bit longer. So it's essentially about them trying to come together and convince everyone who doesn't want to come home to come home and then make it back to their real lives. So I really loved volume 1 of this comic. I gave it 5 stars. I haven't loved any following volume quite as much, and I did give volumes 3 and 4 4 stars each. The thing that I really like about this comic is that it's not super long-winded. As we discussed with Pretty Little Liars, if your series is long-winded and full of filler, typically not my jam, and that does definitely apply to comics as well, especially comics actually. I do find that there are issues in a lot of the comic or manga series that I've read that definitely would be considered as filler. So I liked that this had a very clear beginning and end. We had a goal, we got there eventually with little fuss in the middle. So actually I've read series in the past, or I thought about reading series in the past knowing that they only have 3 volumes, and it's kind of put me off. But with this knowledge, I would maybe consider picking up series like that in the future. I really loved the kind of imagination present in volume 1. I loved how the world was executed. I loved how the characters that these people had created, these teenagers had created, how they became these characters and the impacts and consequences and advantages that had on them in the game, but also in their everyday lives when they'd returned. And I feel like throughout the middle, like exploring the fantasy world, we lost a little bit of that exploration, maybe because it's shorter. I did love the literary references in this series though, and the way that they influence the world building. I feel like my struggle with the end though, and the later 2 volumes in particular, is that it got very complicated and I couldn't quite wrap my brain around it. I feel like I would need to reread, because the way that this world has influenced the real world is kind of revealed more and more as you go throughout the series, and the specifics of it get into like wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff, and that fried my brain a little bit. But yeah, this is a comic series that I definitely enjoyed and I would recommend, especially if you're like an RPG fan, which I'm not. Well, I am, but like a video game RPG, not like a tabletop RPG. So if you're a tabletop RPG fan, would definitely recommend this one. And then the final book that I read for July was a reread. This is what I read while I was on holiday, and I have rated it, but I also haven't rated it. Which I will explain, but it is Way of Kings Part 1 by Brandon Sanderson. So this is the first half of one book in the Stormlight Archive. It is the first book in the Stormlight Archive. So I currently rated it as a 4, but I will not be actually rating it until I've read Part 2, and then I'll be rating the entire thing as a whole, because there is payoff in this book. I know, because I've read it before. There's not really any payoff in this. It's like a very slow build, and that is because it is the first half of a book. So I feel like I can't judge it as a book. I can only judge it in like as a whole with Part 2 as well, if that makes sense. The Stormlight Archive, I have done more extensive reviews on the books in this series when I read them for the first time, but the Stormlight Archive is a series that you can't really give the synopsis to, because what the series is actually about has nothing to do with the starting point of this series. But as we start off, we are following people who are somewhat related to one half of a war. There was a peace treaty between these 2 people who've been at war for a while. They're the Alethi, which is a like human kingdom, and the Parshendi, which are a different race. And they had a peace treaty, or were trying to establish a peace treaty, when the Parshendi assassinated the human king of Alethkar. And so the brother of the king and like the king's son, who is the new king, have declared war against the Parshendi until they feel that they have achieved their vengeance. So we are following people who are all tied to, at the beginning anyway, who are all associated with somewhat to the Alethi side of the war. So our main characters are the general, Dalinar, his son Adolin, a slave who is a bridge runner for the army, which is Kaladin, and Shallan, who is the new apprentice, or she's trying to seek an apprenticeship with the king's sister. This is a martial fantasy to start off with. It is not super magical aside from like little elements of the world, but as the series builds, it gets more and more magical, and it is more to do with this like ancient order of knights and magic swords and glowing atoms that are alive. If that makes any sense. If you know, you know. But something that I really love about this series is that the characters don't think that the world that they're in is weird, but as a reader, you're like, this is weird, man. This is not an environment that these people should be living in, and the fact that they think that this is normal is a little bit odd. And as the series goes on, the characters start to question the things around them a little bit more, and that is when we start to get answers about this world as like things are developing throughout the series. So because of that, this book, when I first read it, did not have a clue what was going on. I didn't know who the characters were. I didn't know why they were relevant. Everything was going over my head. And so something that I really enjoyed about this reread is that now I know a lot more about this world. Now I'm familiar with this world and these characters. Everything made a little bit more sense. Now saying that, it has been a while since I read the first 3 books in this series. So I was reading it a little bit like, I know this is relevant later on, but I can't remember the specifics. So I still had a lot of enjoyment in it in that regard, and that it didn't feel like it was a book that I'd necessarily necessarily read before. It felt like somewhat vaguely familiar, but not like boring in any way. And I think that the fact that I had read it before, but I wasn't super familiar with it, kind of propelled me through the text a little bit more, because I was more interested than I was the first time around because I had that prior knowledge, but not bored because the knowledge wasn't super fresh. So I'm really excited to continue. I really wish I could have got into Way of Kings I am holding Way of Kings Part 2, I've just realised. I read Way of Kings Part 1 and I put Way of Kings Part 1 back in my TBR, and I'm now holding Way of Kings Part 2 and telling you I've read it, and I haven't. But I read Way of Kings Part 1. I'm hoping to read Way of Kings Part 2 very, very soon. But alas, the first video that I am filming, the first vlog that I am filming for August is Shelve It or Scrap It episode 7, which takes precedence. But those are all of the books that I read in July. I think I did all right. And it wasn't a bad month. It wasn't a great month, but it wasn't an awful month, you know? Down in the comments, let me know what your favourite book that you read in July was. Mine was The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy. And with that in mind, leave me a skull emoji down in the comments if you would like to leave me a little something to let me know that you were here, but you don't feel like you have anything to say. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Patreon if you would like to join me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.